This podcast comes to you from the University of Toronto, Mississauga. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the university operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to work on this land, and we strive toward peace and reconciliation among all peoples. Hi, I'm Jill Caskey, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Welcome to Medieval Art Matters, a podcast where we showcase the vitality of contemporary research on the Middle Ages. In each episode, we invite a scholar to talk about a critical issue that shaped the experiences of people living centuries ago and that still matters today. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Erika Loic, for a discussion of today's theme, Medieval Monsters.
Hi, I'm Erika Loic, Assistant Professor of Global Medieval Art at Florida State University. Today we'll be speaking with Asa Mittman, Professor of Medieval Art in the Department of Art History at California State University at Chico. Professor Mittman is the author of Maps and Monsters in Medieval England, 2006, co-author with Susan Kim of Inconceivable Beasts, The Wonders of the East and the Beowulf Manuscript, 2013, and several other studies of monsters and maps. He is also the founding president of Merkstapa, or Monsters, the experimental association for the research of cryptozoology through scholarly theory and practical application.
Welcome, Professor Mittman, and thank you so much for being on our show.
Thanks so much. I'm looking forward to talking.
We're looking at an image from a late medieval manuscript on the podcast page of artofthemiddleages.com. Could you give us a basic sense of the image and the book it's in?
Sure. This is one of the many illustrated folios from a kind of strange and wonderful copy of the Book of John Mandeville. The Book of John Mandeville was the most popular secular text of the Middle Ages. It is largely unknown today, but something like 300 copies of it survive from the Middle Ages across something like a dozen medieval vernacular languages, as well as Latin. This is wildly anomalous for medieval texts. For comparison, the much more famous Beowulf survives in a single copy. So it was incredibly popular. This text was all over the place. And it was incredibly influential. It was, among other things, Columbus's bedside reading on the voyage across the Atlantic, which probably radically colored his interactions with the native populations he found when he arrived here. So this image is a folio that has 3 registers in it. The topmost one, as the little rubric on the side of the image tells us, are the men that have but one eye, men that have one eye. So these are cyclopses. And you can see that standing, there are a male and female, very important. And then seated next to them is one who is eating what appears to be a human or humanoid foot. And so we know that they are anthropophagic as well as one-eyed and probably giant as well. Beneath them are the men who have their eyes in their shoulders. They are called epiphagi, if you want the full term. And curiously, these are also shown with a dark skin tone. And further, there is one who is in a sort of recess in some vegetation, perhaps in a cave, and seems to have a snake in its mouth. So this seems like a triply conflated monstrous group. So it is the headless people, these epiphagi, but the dark skin would have been classed in these texts as quote-unquote Ethiopians, which were a sort of blanket term used to describe any of the dark-skinned peoples of Africa. And the cave-dwelling, lizard-eating people, the troglodytes. So this is 3 races, so-called, 3 groups, 3 peoples, conflated into one. And beneath that are the people who have their eyes behind their shoulders, which is a slightly unusual version of this same kind of either blemi or epiphagi, where it seems like the eyes may be on their backs as opposed to on their fronts. And again, we have very clearly represented a male and female. And then the final feature that I think is really important here is in the second and third registers here, at the left edge is John Mandeville. What makes this text quite different from a lot of the other ones like it is that it gives us a putative narrator. The book begins, I, John Mandeville, knight of England, though I be not worthy, set out from my city of St. Albans in the year 13, whatever. And so he then serves as a consistent thread that runs through the whole text as an eyewitness, giving this sort of asseveration throughout the whole text. I saw, I heard, I tasted. He eats all kinds of strange things with these unusual peoples as well. And so there we see him right there with his book propped open on his lap, looking up and taking notes about the figures that he's seeing, which gives us a sense like these are a people that I, John Mandeville, saw.
So I can't help but notice that this John Mandeville, is not just taking notes, but he is very clearly clothed as opposed to naked. How do you think that this idea of putting these kinds of distinctions or mirror images on the page, how does this work to give us additional information?
So these are beings that are called into existence largely out of contrast with a normate embodiment. It's very important to clarify the difference in what we think of as quote unquote normal and what is the normative or the normate. So normal is just common, and lots of things are normal, but the normative is that which the power structure in a society values most, and that can be incredibly uncommon. So for the makers of this manuscript, which is late medieval English, that normate individual would have been a wealthy, white, Christian. And so if we think about the sort of classic theorization of the male gaze, you'd think of a painting by Jean-Dominique Eng, for example, those harem paintings and odalisques. What you get there is a wealthy, male, European, clothed viewer looking at an unclothed, exoticized, eroticized Eastern female object of attention. And so I think something similar is at play here. Yes, Mandeville is clothed. He is looking at unclothed ones because he is the spectator. They are the spectacle. It creates a power dynamic whereby you were in a position of power over them.
So one thing I'm really curious about, you mentioned that the fellow in the upper left is gnawing on a leg or a foot that appears to be humanoid. And that makes me wonder, are these humans? Are they something else? How do we place their identity within all of the categories that you've put forward so far?
That's the burning question. That's the key question. This kept St. Augustine up at night. So it's not just us wondering about this. This was a point of fascination and or anxiety throughout the early Christian period and throughout the whole of the Middle Ages and on into the early modern period as well. The reason it mattered if they were human is because if they were, then they need to be converted. So that's what's at issue. Whether they were human or not, how do you determine? That was sort of the next question. And it came down to sort of two main points. One is sort of a generalized presentation of some kind of civilization. The other question is speech. Do they have speech? And if they have speech, then they must be humans because animals don't have speech.
And then I guess the question is, if they are human and could be therefore Christianized on some level, would they then cease to be monsters? Would the Cyclops grow another eye? What would happen?
Well, this is a great question, and we have at least one text that answers it very clearly. And this is the Middle English Cursor Mundi, which strange text, and it's this universal history of the world kind of thing. And there's a bit in it where a group of blemmies who are quite like the middle group on this page because they are described as black and blue as lead, which is a common medieval European trope for describing particularly Muslim figures. So these are those black and blue as lead figures who are also headless figures. And they are standing before King David, who is converting them to Christianity. He blesses them with this rod, and when he does so, the text tells us that they became as white as milk, and it says all their shape was made anew. It doesn't specify what exactly that means, but they're becoming white men, white as milk men with heads. So they are ceasing to be the exoticized, othered monster and becoming, quote unquote, like us. That construction of us is really important in a lot of these texts. Mandeville does a lot of work to create a community between him and his audience. You can trust me because I'm like you. And so we are in a community as opposed to all of those people over there. It creates an us that is designed explicitly around the exclusion of them, those other people. And so, yes, these figures become Christians, and then suddenly they are an us, not a them. And so what I think a lot of scholars have taken as a kind of fantasy that the figure awaiting Christianization already looks like, quote unquote, looks like a Christian.
So people coming to an image like this might at first react with shock or amazement. On the other hand, monsters have never gone away. Humanity has never stopped being fascinated. What do you see as some of maybe the similarities between the way monsters function in the Middle Ages and the way monsters continue to function?
Well, I hope monsters never go away because I delight in them. They are wonderful things. The trick to them is that they are often delightful. So they pull us in. I know that we're supposed to always talk about our anxieties about them and their horror, but why do we go to horror movies? Because we're delighted by that. We can say, surely, that these are a very popular form of cultural entertainment now as they were then. And so even if there is an element of horror, like in the anthropophagy that we see here, I call them anthropophagic rather than cannibalistic on purpose because I didn't want to make a judgment call about whether they're human. To be an anthropophage means you are someone who eats humans, or to be a cannibal means you eat your own kind. So how they pertain, how do they correspond to more contemporary monstrosity? Functionally, I think they're very similar. In terms of their details, I think they're often quite different. So I was talking before about how they are constructed largely out of opposition to us, right? And I would say that remains the main operative system for the construction of monsters. I mean, why do we have them at all, right? It's very hard for us to say what we are outside of comparisons. Everything that we know about ourselves, we know because we know of other things, right? So you know your humanity only because you know about the animal kingdom and the plant world and the inanimate world, right? These are the points that allow us to see what we are. Okay, so why monsters, right? And I think the answer to this is somehow all of that is not enough. Those all existed without us. Monsters are the things that we conjure into being just for this purpose. And so that allows them to be much more precise. It allows their points of contrast from us to be the things we choose to be points of contrast. And so, for example, if we want to say, we are the people who eat the correct things, then we show them eating a human and we say, ha, see, that's different from us. So if you want to make that point of comparison, and if you are a medieval Christian, a little bit anxious about the fact that every time at Mass you eat a person, that the host is literally becoming Jesus' body, the wine is literally becoming, through a miracle, Jesus' blood. If this causes some anxiety and therefore you start obsessing about other people who are way, way clearly more cannibalistic than you, then that fixation on cannibals, which is really, really dominant in a lot of medieval and early modern monster tales as well, that becomes powerful and important. There isn't another being out there that would allow medieval Christians to say, though we do this one ritualized version of a kind of cannibalism, those other people do this thing that's really cannibalism. Or these beings, these creatures, there was nothing for them to point at, so they invent them, right? So monsters are the things that we invent to deal with exactly the kinds of points of self-definition that we want to address. And I would say that's what we're still doing. The literal details are different. We don't seem to be really excited about headless people anymore. They were really excited about them. They're one of the most popular monsters for the whole of the Middle Ages. They also show up popularly in early modern sources. We're not really into that anymore, but we are still using monsters, I would argue, for basically the same category of function.
It is kind of fascinating in a way that if monsters are generated out of our imaginations to help us define ourselves and to speak to our anxieties about our place in the world and what's going on outside our immediate territory, like we see in Mandeville, that it's fascinating that some of the monster types endure for centuries. Why this fascination with Cyclops and other creatures that are described in ancient Roman sources, their longevity is striking to me. And I wonder if you could maybe give any explanations for that? Was Pliny just really, really so inventive that his ideas continued to captivate people's attention for centuries? Or did these myths get reinvented with these other layers of meaning? We may take the host in the Eucharist, that's the body of Christ, but at least we're not gnawing on a bloody, raw leg.
I think I can actually make your question even more difficult or vaster to answer, because this group, this common set, this stock batch that are often called the Plinian races, the Plinian peoples, they also appear in ancient Chinese sources, in early modern Japanese sources. The most surprising instance of them that I found is in Navajo tales that were transcribed by the anthropologist Sapir. But they also, you said, was Pliny so creative? He didn't come up with them. They're older than him. And so they are all over the place. And yeah, this is the headless blemmies and the dog-headed cynocephali and the one-footed sciapods and the cannibals and the cyclopses. There's a bunch of them that just appear again and again. These are the same ones that are very often found on medieval world maps. I mean, there are really serious consequences to this. You know, Columbus read this book about how India was filled with monsters. He arrived at what he believed to be the Indies and began a genocide. Now, what is the correct response to monsters? Every text you read just about from the medieval world and the early modern world will tell you the same thing. There's monsters and there's heroes, and the reason we can tell one from the other is the hero is what kills the monster. That's what you're supposed to do. So if you've decided a priori that people is monstrous, then killing them is following the cultural script with which you've been presented, which is why we really should not monsterize other people. I still bristle if we dip over into dehumanizing, monsterizing, and demonizing kind of language, because I know where that goes. That goes to slaughter, and that shouldn't be our answer to differences. So why these? Why do they keep going? It's a great question, and I have what may be an unsatisfying answer, but this is what I will go with, at least provisionally, which is the texts that endure are ones that are kind of open, that have a porosity to them, that are not overdetermined. So the entire text for the blemmies, the headless people that appears in the Wonders of the East, is on another island in the Brixantes. They're born people without heads. They have their eyes and their mouths on their breasts, and they're 8 feet tall and 8 feet wide. That's it. That's the whole text. There's nothing else. So what that means is you can read onto them anything you wish. I don't want to be too elevating of this wonderful text I adore, but this is how texts like the Torah or the Christian Bible or the Quran work. This is how texts like Buddhist sutras work. There's an openness to them which allows them to remain relevant as cultures change, as peoples change, as people turn to them for new things, for different things coming from different perspectives. They will continue to speak to them because they're not overdetermined. They're not a finite, codified set. And they provide a very broad range of differences. These differences are in terms of embodiments in various ways, excesses and lacks, too many heads, too few heads, too many legs, too few legs. And so, because there's so many points of contrast, that allows various cultures in various times and places to find vital elements for their own kind of points of opposition and contrast and fascination.
So maybe I can ask, as a way to round out the discussion, where you think the study of monsters is going, or where you would like it to go?
Well, that's a great question. So when I got into this racket, back when I was in graduate school, there were some really wonderful studies of monsters in the pre-modern world. You know, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen had written some of his work already by the time I was in graduate school, John Block Friedman's early stuff. And what I found was really lacking at that point, though, was community of scholarship. There were individual things, this article over here, this book over there, but it all felt like people were, toiling in isolation. And I'm a very big believer that scholarship is a communal project. I adore writing with people rather than writing solo. I'm finishing a solo book now, and it is misery and dreariness to work on it by myself. So that was one of the things I worked really hard on back when I founded Merkstapa with a bunch of friends, we co-founded it, was to create a space and a context and a community wherein this work could be done. And now I would say that's actually quite robust. There are all of these books that exist now that are source readers and primary sources and theoretical sources. There's a ton of courses being taught all over the place, conferences, conference sessions. All this stuff is very, very active now. I would say that the directions that the study of monsters have gone have followed larger trends in scholarship. Where I hope it goes? Well, all right, I have two thoughts on this. One, I am now, the establishment. And so I hope that it's new scholars, grad students coming up, people who are starting their first teaching jobs that guide it. And I hope that I can be helpful to them in helping them find platforms and helping them find places and ways to publish and ways to speak. Rather than me suggesting where it would go, I would like to see where the new folks who have new ideas and are more well-read in the latest stuff, perhaps than I am, I would like them to guide it. The only caveat that I would say is I believe, I'm a historian of art, but I'm a historian. And I believe the job of the historian is to have one eye on the past and the other always on the present. Because what's the point of studying the past if it has nothing to do with the present and the future? I would like to be done with that critique where people use the term presentist like it's a bad thing, to think, well, this work about the past is relevant today. That's a condemnation you read in book reviews. This makes no sense to me. I would like to see people more open, dare I say more honest about their political and personal agendas in their scholarship. I would like us to acknowledge that scholarship that seeks to maintain the status quo is in fact as politicized as scholarship that argues for change. So I would like to see monster scholarship, monster studies, monster theory, as I would like to see all branches of scholarship, more clear and more open about what's at stake individually for the authors and what's at stake, what is the value, what is the function, what is the purpose of the scholarship.
Thank you so much, Professor Mittman. That was really, really fantastic. And clearly how you've unpacked this single page in the manuscript shows how rich the topic is and how indeed it ought to have a brilliant future as other people follow your path and delve into this imagery from a whole range of interdisciplinary perspectives. So thanks so much for coming to speak to us today.
Well, thank you so much. As you can probably tell, I love ranting on about monsters. I hope people will look at this, and I hope they don't follow my path. I hope they find new paths that I never thought to follow. And I look very much forward to reading the great things that other people come up with about these remarkable images.
That was Professor Asa Mittman of California State University at Chico on the meanings of monsters in the Middle Ages and why studying monsters is still relevant today and for the future.
You've been listening to Medieval Art Matters, hosted by Erika Loic and me, Jill Caskey. Medieval Art Matters complements the book written by Jill Caskey, Adam Cohen, and Linda Safran, called Art and Architecture of the Middle Ages, Exploring a Connected World. It is published by Cornell University Press. For more information, go to the website that accompanies the book, artofthemiddleages.com, where you'll also find more podcasts in this series.
Medieval Art Matters is made possible by the support of the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto St. George campus and the Office of the Vice Principal and Dean, University of Toronto, Mississauga. Many thanks to the Toronto Consort for providing the music.
This podcast was brought to you by Cited Media Productions. Thanks for listening.
You have been listening to a Cited Media production. CIDED. Find out more at citedmedia.ca.